Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Dr. Kim is a scientist, a leading voice on vaccination. He also led the US military's research program on the HIV vaccine. Good evening, Dr. Kim. South Korea's response is being called the gold standard, but recently we heard that there were around 50 cases of patients who had recovered, but they tested positive again. Is there a second wave?
So that's a great question. So I think the most important thing that we have to do, and that I think the government of Korea does, is it looks at the long-term trend. When we look at new cases, remember that we're looking 2 weeks in the past, because those cases were infected, 2 weeks or so ago. So I think Korea has now seen several weeks of, numbers between 50 and 100, and the last several days under 50. And, that's a very promising trend. I think that what we have to realize about COVID is we're probably never going to be rid of it completely, and that now that the Korean government is no longer in the the immediate control phase, they're now in a phase where they're going to have to be vigilant.
Well, this is a new crisis for everyone, Dr. Kim. Governments are trying to learn from each other. Can one country's model be replicated in another?
Another very difficult question, but one I think that is very important to answer, because people have asked, can what has been done in South Korea be done elsewhere? And to a large extent, the policy, which is a WHO policy of testing, tracking, isolating, and treating, is really one that has shown that it works in other countries around the world that are beginning to put the brakes on the explosive growth of the COVID-19 pandemic. The problem is that not all countries were able to begin this process early enough. And so, for instance, you saw in the United States or in Italy, where the governments were a bit late in being able to fully institute this policy. And as a result, a rather larger number of people were asymptomatically infected and were able to spread the disease to others. So, eventually countries catch up. The United States has done millions of COVID tests and probably needs to do many more. And as countries plan to eventually at some point, pull back on the controls that have been put on, they're going to need to make sure that they are ready to do the kind of testing, tracking, treating, and isolating that is necessary in order to keep any future outbreaks small.
In India, testing has been ramped up, but challenges still remain here. The numbers have been going up in India. How do you see India's response to this?
So I think India is where many countries are in the beginning, and it's very difficult to look at in the beginning and be hopeful. But I think India, like many of the other countries around the world, and in a country as large as India, you have to look to a model like China, where you have to be able to start to undertake the kinds of things that are going to be necessary in order to limit the spread of COVID-19 within the population. So I think India is still in very early days. And I think that the things that the Indian government is doing, hopefully, will have the same impact that other effective governments have had around the world in limiting the spread of COVID-19 in the general population.
Right. How do you deal with the problem of scale? India is a country of more than 1.3 billion people. How much testing will be enough testing in India?
Another very interesting question, but I think that you'll be able to tell as you look at the numbers. When you begin to reach the point where testing has caught up with the epidemic, often at that point, the apparent death rate appears to drop because you're picking up many more asymptomatic infections. And I think that the government of India, through its careful monitoring of the testing that's done and hopefully the reporting of those tests back to the central government, is going to be a critical place where information can be gathered and shared, and clear, concise statements and decisions can be made and relayed to the Indian people. I mean, I think that was part of South Korea's success, and that's a success that many other countries have duplicated. Very clear, concise, decisive messaging from a single source.
Right, at least 30 countries in the world have reached out to India for hydroxychloroquine. Some call it the miracle drug. Others say that there is no scientific evidence that it actually works, that the evidence is anecdotal. What is your assessment? Does this drug work?
So I think you need to remember, though, the most important thing is that if we do nothing, in general, 98% of the people with COVID-19 infection eventually recover. So the key to testing all of these drugs, whether it's hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir, which is an antiviral, or testing a vaccine like BCG, is that we really need to do this in a manner that allows us to get answers, because all of the medicines carry some risk of side effects. And, in the case of hydroxychloroquine, there could be cardiac side effects. And if we give it with another drug called azithromycin, which was one of the combinations people had advocated, it can actually potentiate the effect on the heart. So I think, again, I'm a clinical scientist. I'm a person who believes that when we do something, we should do it in order to understand what the mechanism is and whether it's actually working. Because I think governments around the world want people to get better. They want to treat citizens of their own countries that are infected with COVID-19. But I think that all of them know that the most important thing is that the medicines that they give are safe and effective, and that we need to do the kind of studies correctly to be able to tell whether this is true.
Well, some governments also act because they want to be seen to be doing something. A recent study, Dr. Kim, said that lockdowns can only delay the spread of this virus. Yet breaking the chain seems to be the best alternative right now. Countries are extending lockdowns. It all hinges on how quickly we find a cure. So how close, I want to ask you, are we to a cure?
Dr. Fauci has said it'll take 12 to 18 months to the point that we know the vaccine works. And that means that the point where we know that the vaccine prevents infection or disease. And then a part of the government, whatever government it is, the Indian government, the US government, the European Union, has to decide whether, in fact, the trial did what the company or the organization claims that it did, that it prevented infection and disease. That process can take a long time, although because COVID is such an important problem, it can be done in a relatively shorter time, maybe on the order of weeks rather than months. Then we have to make sure that there's a recommendation to use it. So someone has to say, this vaccine works. We're going to use it and recommend that the following people be vaccinated. That usually takes a few months, but again, that can be shortened. And then probably the most important thing, and I think India will be very important in this because India provides a lot of the vaccines for global health. Someone has to make it, and someone has to make a lot of it. I mean, we're talking about 7 billion people in this world. All of them potentially should be vaccinated. So we're going to need billions and billions of doses of vaccine, and we're going to need someone to make it, and we're going to need someone to make it quickly. So as this 12 to 18 months of testing is going on, someone's going to have to think very carefully about how we're going to make as many doses as we can, as quickly as we can, and then someone else, some other group will have to decide, and hopefully this will be decided before we have an effective vaccine, someone's going to have to decide how we're going to allocate it. How we're going to allocate it fairly, and who needs it first. I mean, in a country like India, who should get the first vaccine? Should it be the doctors and nurses? Should it be the army? Should it be the police force or first responders? Should it be people who work in grocery stores? Because these are all critical parts of how society has to function in the setting of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, you talked about India's role. India is also supplying life-saving drugs to many countries. In which other ways, Dr. Kim, according to you, can India play a role in this global fight against the coronavirus?
India has a big role to play. I mean, not only because of its population, but we know that India has a very, very important vaccine manufacturing industry. About 70% of the vaccines used around the world for extended immunization programs are made in India. I mean, almost every child in the world has received a vaccine made in India. And that's really important. It means that Indian companies put out 1 billion vaccines a year. And that's the kind of capacity that we're going to need in order to get this vaccine to the people who need it all over the world, not just people in the United States, not just people in Europe, but for people in India, in Africa, in Asia. And so we're going to need companies that have the capacity and know-how to make vaccines. So that's on the manufacturing side. I think one of the things that we may overlook or may be overlooking is, we know that India has great universities and a lot of very talented and intelligent people, a thriving biotech industry, and all of those people, all of those resources could be brought to bear on this, probably the greatest pandemic threat in the last 100 years. And I think India has a lot to contribute.